I've seen petty HOA drama before trash cans left out too long, lawns mowed a day late, but nothing prepared me for the day. A smug neighbor shoved a court order in my face and told me I had exactly 7 days to get out of my own home. The thing had an official seal, a judge's signature, and all the legal jargon you'd expect. My wife's hands shook as she read it. Karen, of course, smirked like she'd just won the neighborhood lottery. But here's the thing, when you fake legal documents, you better be very sure whose name you're forging, because the judge on that paper, she wasn't just any judge. She happened to be my mother-in-law, and Karen had just stepped into the biggest trap of her life. I've lived in the same cul-de-sac for nearly 15 years, in a quiet little suburban neighborhood just outside of Springfield. We've got white picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, and more HOA rules than the Constitution has amendments. My wife, Linda, and I moved here after I retired from the fire department. She's a third-grade teacher, sweet, calm, the type who bakes cookies for the new neighbors. Me, I'm more of the fix things with duct tape and common sense kind of guy. For the most part, life here is peaceful, except for one thorn in my side, Karen Miller. Now, Karen isn't her real name, but trust me, it fits her like a custom-tailored sweater. She's the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, though technically she's just the vice president. That title doesn't stop her from patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard and a permanent scowl, writing up violations like she's handing out speeding tickets. Karen's favorite pastime, making my life miserable. I once got a notice because my American flag was too faded. Another time, she complained that the garden gnome by our mailbox was distracting to drivers. And God forbid you park your truck in the street overnight, she'll have a tow truck on speed dial. Still, I tried to keep the peace. Linda would tell me, she's not worth the stress. Honey, just smile and nod. And for years, I did just that. But a couple months ago, we decided to freshen up our yard, planted some rose bushes, set up a little bistro table under the oak tree, even added solar lights along the walkway. It looked charming, if I do say so myself. Of course, it didn't take long for Karen to come marching over, pointing at the solar lights like they were a federal offense. Those aren't in compliance with Section 14B of the HOA guidelines, she declared, like she was reading from a sacred scroll. I told her as politely as I could that the lights were staying, since they didn't bother anyone but her. She huffed, scribbled something on her clipboard, and stormed off. The next few weeks were tense. I'd catch her taking pictures of our yard from across the street. She'd make snide comments about people who think they're above the rules loud enough for Linda to hear. We figured she'd eventually get bored and find someone else to hassle. We were wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when the knock came at the door. Linda was grading papers in the kitchen, and I was halfway through my second cup of coffee. I opened the door to find Karen standing there with a manila envelope in hand. She didn't even say hello, just shoved the envelope at me with a smirk. "This is official court business," she said, her voice dripping with self-importance. "You've been ordered to vacate the property within 7 days. I blinked at her, thinking it was some kind of bad joke. But when I opened the envelope, there it was, a document with a gold embossed seal, fancy legal language, and the signature of a county judge at the bottom. Linda came over, reading it with wide eyes. "Oh my God, is this real?" Karen folded her arms. "Very real. You've been in violation of multiple HOA codes, and the court has ruled in our favor. I'd start packing if I were you." She turned on her heel and strutted back down the driveway, leaving me standing there with my mouth open. Something about the whole thing felt off. The wording seemed too sloppy for an official court order, and that signature there was something familiar about it, though I couldn't quite place it at the time. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny flicker of recognition was about to unravel Karen's entire scheme, and she'd never see it coming. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The rest of that Tuesday morning felt like walking through fog. Linda sat at the kitchen table, the so-called court order lying between us like a poisonous snake. She kept rereading it, her brow furrowed deeper with each pass. "Honey," she said, "this? It looks official. What if it's real?" I took another sip of coffee, more to buy time than because I needed the caffeine. If it's real, then I'm a tap-dancing penguin. Look at the margins crooked, the seals printed, not embossed. And this font looks like she typed it up in Microsoft Word and slapped a seal on it. Still, doubt nagged at me. Karen had been on the HOA board for years. Maybe she had connections. Maybe she'd found some loophole. I knew one thing: if this paper was legit, we were in for the fight of our lives. Linda suggested calling a lawyer right away, but I wanted to start with the source. I grabbed my truck keys and the order and headed straight for the county courthouse downtown. The building has that classic American civic look, columns out front, a flag snapping in the breeze, the faint smell of coffee and bureaucracy in the air. Inside, I found the Civil Records Office. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Patty with cat-eye glasses, looked like she'd been doing this job since the Eisenhower administration. I slid the paper across the counter. "Can you check if there's an active case under our names?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the document, and gave me a look that could curdle milk. "Where did you get this?" "Neighbor handed it to me this morning. Says it's a court order to vacate our house." Patty snorted. "This isn't even close to a real court order. Wrong formatting. No case number in the system. And that signature." She tapped the bottom of the page. "That's not Judge Harrison's handwriting. I've seen her sign 100 times. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a hot rush of anger. "So it's fake." "Fake as a $3 bill," Patty said. "If I were you, I'd keep this safe and maybe talk to law enforcement. Forging a court document is a felony." I thanked her, folded the paper carefully, and headed out. My hands were gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Karen had crossed a line. This wasn't a petty HOA fine or a nasty letter. This was fraud. When I got home, Linda was waiting. "Well, it's fake," I said. "And not just a little fake, so fake it's criminal." Her relief was obvious, but so was the worry. So what do we do? That was the million-dollar question. My first instinct was to march over to Karen's and confront her, but I knew better. She'd twist it, claim I was harassing her, maybe even call the cops. No, this needed to be done smart. We decided to start documenting everything. I pulled the footage from our doorbell camera showing her handing me the envelope. Then I remembered something 2 days earlier. I'd seen her lugging a stack of papers into the FedEx office down on Main Street. The place had security cameras. If I could get that footage. The next morning, I drove to the FedEx office and asked the manager if he'd be willing to check. Turns out, he already knew Karen. She comes in here all the time making copies for her HOA stuff. He said, when I explained what had happened, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You might want to see this." On the screen, clear as day, there was Karen at the self-serve printer, feeding in blank legal-style paper, then pulling out a gold-colored sticker sheet, the kind used for official seals. She printed, stamped, and even practiced a signature a couple of times before stuffing the papers into an envelope. I left that store with a thumb drive in my pocket and a slow smile forming. The evidence was stacking up, but Karen wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I found another note in our mailbox, unsigned, typed, and dripping with threats. Vacate the property before the 7th day or face legal consequences beyond your imagination. She even underlined legal consequences twice, like she thought it would make her sound scarier. I showed the note to Linda, who shook her head. She's unhinged. The next few days, Karen strutted around the cul-de-sac like she was already redecorating our living room. I overheard her telling Mrs. Cunningham from 2 doors down, by next week, they'll be gone, and this place will finally look respectable. Respectable. Right. This from a woman whose lawn ornaments looked like they were stolen from a yard sale in 1983. By Friday, I knew we had enough to blow her scheme wide open, the fake court order itself. Confirmation from the courthouse that no such case existed. Video of her creating the document. The threatening letter. What I didn't know was that the final nail in her coffin was already in my house, sitting across the dinner table, quietly stirring her tea. See? Linda's mom doesn't talk much about her job. She's modest, keeps to herself, never throws her weight around. But she's been a county judge for over 20 years. And the second she saw that signature on the fake order, her lips pressed into a thin line. I've only seen once before the day some kid threw a rock through her kitchen window. "I know this signature," she said quietly. "Because it's supposed to be mine." I nearly dropped my fork. Linda's mom, Judge Evelyn Harper, was the exact judge Karen had pretended to forge, and that meant our HOA Queen Bee had just committed a felony against a sitting judge, who also happened to be my mother-in-law. I didn't know whether to laugh or start popping popcorn. One thing was certain, Karen's little game was about to turn into the show of the century. That night, after the revelation from Judge Evelyn Harper, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, replaying the situation in my head. Karen had always been a pain, but this was different. She hadn't just tried to intimidate us, she'd committed a full-blown felony, and not against just anyone. She had forged the signature of a sitting judge who also happened to know exactly where to find her in the neighborhood. The next morning, over coffee, Evelyn looked across the table at me. "You've got enough evidence to bury her," she said matter-of-factly. "But we're going to do this the right way. No yelling across the driveway, no public shouting matches. We build the case and then—" She gave a small, satisfied smile. "We let the hammer fall." I'd never been more grateful to have her in the family. Linda and I spent the next couple of days gathering every scrap of evidence we could. I printed copies of the fake court order, the threatening letter, and still images from the FedEx office footage. Evelyn suggested I also keep a log of Karen's behavior dates, times, exact words she'd said. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to be ramping things up. She started parking her car right in front of our house, sitting in it for hours like some kind of HOA surveillance agent. I could see her through the blinds, jotting things down in her ever-present notebook. One afternoon, she got out of the car and started measuring the distance from our mailbox to the curb with a tape measure, muttering to herself. Linda tried to ignore it, but I could tell it was getting under her skin. "This is harassment," she said one evening, her voice tight. "She's trying to make us snap so she can claim we threatened her." I knew she was right, so I made a rule: no talking to Karen, no responding to her baiting. Everything would go through the official process now. The tipping point came a few days later when Karen decided to bring reinforcements. I was out front watering the roses when I saw her strutting up the street with two other HOA board members in tow, Greg, who always smells faintly of mothballs, and Sandra, whose personality is as bland as her potato salad. Karen stopped at the edge of our driveway, arms crossed. "We're here to conduct an exterior inspection of your property," she announced, like she was the sheriff in some old western. I set the hose down and looked at her. "Not without a warrant." "You're not." Greg shuffled uncomfortably. "Karen, maybe no." She cut him off. "We have the authority under HOA bylaws." Evelyn, who had been sitting on our porch with a cup of tea, rose slowly and stepped forward. She didn't say a word, just gave Karen a long, level stare. Something in that look must have rattled Karen, because after a tense pause, she turned on her heel and marched away, muttering about non-compliance. Later that afternoon, Evelyn called a contact at the local police department. She didn't tell them who she was at first, just laid out the facts. When she finally mentioned the forged signature, there was a long silence on the line. "Judge Harper, we'll be right on it," the officer said. By now, word had started to spread in the neighborhood. People noticed the police visiting our house, the plainclothes officers who came to review the evidence. A few neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact with us began stopping by to see how we were holding up. Translation, they wanted the gossip. I wasn't about to spill everything, but I will admit I dropped a few hints. Let's just say the situation's about to turn legally interesting. I told old Mr. Watkins across the street. His eyebrows shot up, and I knew by the end of the day, half the block would have heard. Karen, on the other hand, was oblivious. She was still strutting around like she had already won, bragging to anyone who would listen about removing troublemakers from the neighborhood. What she didn't know was that Evelyn had set a court date, not for an eviction, but for a criminal hearing, and Karen's name was right there on the docket. In the days leading up to it, I played my part. I acted nervous whenever Karen was within earshot, making sure she thought her little plan was still working. Linda would come out onto the porch, wringing her hands, sighing dramatically about having to pack up. I even made a show of taking a couple of boxes out to the garage. Karen bought it hook, line, and sinker. One evening, she even leaned over the fence and said, "Don't take it too hard, dear. Not everyone's cut out for living here." I bit my tongue so hard I'm surprised I didn't taste blood. Evelyn, meanwhile, was preparing her opening statement. "It's not just about proving the documents are fake," she told me. "It's about showing intent." She didn't make a mistake. She deliberately tried to use the authority of the court for personal gain. Hearing her talk like that sent a shiver down my spine, not because I was scared, but because I realized Karen had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The night before the hearing, Linda and I sat out on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You think this will finally be the end of it?" I looked at her, then at the warm glow of our home, the place we'd built together, the garden we'd planted, the life we'd made. "Oh, it'll be the end of something," I said. "But for Karen, it's just the beginning of a very bad chapter." And somewhere across the street, I swear I could see her silhouette in the window, notebook in hand, still scribbling away, completely unaware that her next appointment wasn't with the HOA board, but with a judge who knew her handwriting better than anyone else. The morning of the hearing, the air in our kitchen felt charged, like the moment right before a summer thunderstorm. Linda moved around quietly, making coffee, while Evelyn sat at the table reviewing a neatly organized folder of evidence. She wasn't wearing her judge's robe, just a simple navy suit, but somehow she still carried the same unshakable authority. "Remember," she said without looking up, "let her talk first. People like Karen dig their own graves if you give them enough rope." I nodded. "So I just sit there and smile?" Evelyn glanced up with the faintest smirk. "Think you can manage that?" By the time we arrived at the courthouse, Karen was already there, pacing in the hallway with a folder clutched to her chest. She was dressed in what I can only describe as her power outfit, a stiff blazer 2 sizes too small, and a pair of heels that made her teeter like a baby giraffe. When she spotted us, her lips curled into a smug little grin. Well, she said, "didn't think you'd actually show up. Must be humiliating, dragging this out when you know you've lost." I just gave her a polite nod and walked past, biting back every sarcastic reply bouncing around in my head. Evelyn didn't even acknowledge her, just brushed by like Karen was a piece of furniture in the hallway. Inside the courtroom, the bailiff called the session to order. The judge presiding was an older man named Harold Simmons, a colleague of Evelyn's who had no idea about her connection to me or to the forged document. Evelyn took a seat at the prosecution's table, while I sat directly behind her. Karen, representing herself because of course she was, stood at the defense table flipping through her papers. "Ms. Miller," Judge Simmons began, "you're here today in response to charges of forging a court document and attempted fraud. How do you plead?" Karen lifted her chin. "Not guilty, Your Honor. This is all a misunderstanding. I was simply enforcing HOA regulations, and that's enough for now." Simmons cut her off. "Prosecution, your opening statement." Evelyn rose slowly, every movement deliberate. "Your Honor, this is not a misunderstanding. This is a calculated attempt to weaponize the authority of the court for personal gain. The defendant created a fraudulent eviction order, complete with a forged judicial signature, and delivered it to my clients with the explicit intent to force them from their home." Her voice was calm, steady, no theatrics, no shouting, just pure, undeniable authority. Karen tried to interrupt, but Simmons held up a hand. "You'll have your turn. Ms. Miller," Evelyn continued. "The evidence will show the document was not only falsified, but bore the signature of a sitting county judge myself. And I can say with absolute certainty, Your Honor, that I never signed it. It was like someone had dropped a live wire in the room." Karen's head snapped toward Evelyn, her eyes wide. You're," she sputtered. "Yes," Evelyn said evenly. "I am Judge Evelyn Harper, and you forged my name. I swear, if there had been a soundtrack, this is where the dramatic dun-dun would have played." Karen's face went through about 6 shades of red before she settled on something between panic and disbelief. I didn't know. That much is obvious," Evelyn replied. From there, Evelyn laid it all out: the lack of any case number in court records, the analysis of the signature, The video footage from FedEx office showing Karen printing the document and applying the fake seal. Every piece of evidence was projected onto a screen for the courtroom to see. The FedEx footage was my personal favorite. Watching Karen on camera, hunched over the printer with that same smug look she wore handing me the envelope. It was like watching a magician's trick in reverse. Karen tried to argue that she had been instructed by the HOA to enforce certain codes, but Evelyn shut that down instantly. Even if that were true, which it is not, the HOA does not have the authority to issue a court order, and certainly not one bearing a forged judicial signature. When Simmons finally gave Karen the floor, she stumbled through a rambling speech about protecting property values and maintaining standards. She tried to paint herself as the hero of the neighborhood, unfairly targeted by troublemakers like me. Unfortunately for her, Simmons had just watched 10 minutes of high-definition video showing her commit a felony in a copy shop. His patience wore thin. Ms. Miller, do you have any evidence that contradicts what we've seen today? Karen hesitated, then muttered something about needing more time. Denied. Simmons said flatly, "From my seat." I could see the exact moment reality hit her. Her shoulders slumped, her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blazer, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked small. Evelyn wrapped up by formally submitting all evidence to the court, along with a request for restitution to cover the emotional distress and legal costs she'd caused us. Simmons leaned back in his chair. Given the overwhelming evidence, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. In the meantime, Ms. Miller, you are barred from any contact with the plaintiffs or their property. The gavel came down with a satisfying crack. Karen just stood there, stunned, as the bailiff approached to escort her out. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. As we left the courtroom, Evelyn turned to me. "That," she said, "is why you let the process work. People like her eventually hang themselves. You just have to give them the rope." Linda slipped her arm through mine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Outside, the sun was shining, the air smelled fresh, and the courthouse steps felt like a victory parade route. Back in the parking lot, I spotted Karen being led to her car by a friend, her head down. She didn't look our way, didn't wave, didn't smirk, and for the first time since I'd met her, she had nothing to say. Winning in court was satisfying, don't get me wrong, but for me, the real fun began afterward. See, Evelyn had made it clear the legal side was over for now. Karen was convicted, awaiting sentencing, and barred from coming near us. But in the court of public opinion, the neighborhood, her reputation was still hanging by a thread, and I was about to snip it. The first step was subtle. Linda and I resumed our normal lives, which for us meant enjoying our yard, having coffee on the porch, and hosting the occasional weekend barbecue. I made a point of inviting every neighbor, yes, even the ones who used to avoid us when Karen was spreading her poison. Word traveled fast that the eviction had been a hoax. Neighbors started asking questions, and I was all too happy to tell them the truth, sprinkled with just enough dramatic pauses to keep them hooked. I never exaggerated the facts. Oh no, I didn't have to. The image of Karen in that FedEx office, printing fake court papers, was already outrageous enough. By the second week after the hearing, HOA meetings were tense. Karen hadn't resigned from the board yet, but the whispers were getting louder. People wanted her out. She tried to show up at one meeting via Zoom, but half the members muted her before she could finish her first sentence. I decided to twist the knife just a bit. Remember those solar lights she complained about? I installed more, twice as many. In fact, lining the walkway and wrapping them around the oak tree like it was Christmas in July. Every night, our yard glowed like a runway, and every night I sat on the porch sipping iced tea, knowing full well Karen could see it from her living room window. Linda, bless her, went along with it. She even started baking cookies for neighbors and leaving them in decorative tins with a little note that read, "From the falsely evicted family on Elm Street, justice served." The neighbors loved it. The HOA board finally called a special meeting to address recent misconduct by a board member. Evelyn didn't attend. She said she had more important cases than an HOA soap opera, but I went, mostly to watch the fireworks. Karen showed up looking like she hadn't slept in a week. The president of the HOA, A man who'd always been her ally read through a list of violations: abuse of authority, harassment of residents, forging legal documents. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming the whole thing was blown out of proportion. Someone in the back shouted, "You forged a judge's signature," and the room erupted in murmurs. In the end, the vote to remove her from the board wasn't even close. She got exactly one vote in her favor, her own. From that day on, Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. She stopped walking her usual patrol routes, stopped gossiping at the mailbox, stopped glaring from behind her blinds. It was like she'd evaporated. But my favorite moment of all came a few days later. I was out front trimming the roses when a delivery truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. The driver carried a large box to her porch, a box with big black letters reading, "For official use only." I could see her peeking through the curtains, hesitant to open the door. When she finally stepped out, I called across the street, "Careful! Karen wouldn't want anyone to think you're forging more official documents." Linda nearly dropped the watering can, laughing. Now, I didn't want to be cruel. Well, maybe just a little. But there's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who used intimidation and lies realize they're no longer feared. Meanwhile, Evelyn's quiet pride was all the reward I needed. She never gloated, judges don't do that, but every so often, she'd give me a look that said, "You handled this the right way." And honestly, she was right. If I'd gone full cowboy at the start, storming over, shouting, demanding, Karen might have spun it against me. Instead, we'd taken her down with her own rope, and the whole neighborhood got to see it happen. The final cherry on top, a week before her sentencing, Karen's house went up for sale. Rumor had it she was moving to another town for a fresh start. I wondered how fresh that start would feel once potential buyers Googled her name and found the court record. On the morning the for sale sign went up, I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, and gave her a little wave. She didn't wave back, just slipped into her car and drove off. Linda joined me, slipping her arm through mine. Think that's the last we'll see of her from across the street? Probably. But something tells me she's going to remember us for a long, long time. We stood there in the warm sunlight, our yard glowing with twice as many solar lights as before. And I couldn't help but think in the end, revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's just making sure the whole world sees the truth. And in this case, the truth was brighter than a runway. Karen's sentencing day was one of those crisp fall mornings when the air smells faintly of wood smoke and everything feels sharper, clearer. Linda and I drove to the courthouse with Evelyn in the back seat, quiet but focused. We didn't have to be there. Evelyn said sentencing was mostly procedural, but I wasn't about to miss the grand finale. When we walked into the courtroom, Karen was already sitting at the defense table. I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the stiff blazer and smug expression. In their place was a plain gray sweater, hair pulled back in a loose bun, and eyes fixed on the table in front of her. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Simmons took the bench, flipping through the paperwork like a man reviewing the grocery list of someone on death row. "Ms. Miller," he began, "you have been found guilty of forging a court document, attempting to defraud your neighbors, and harassment. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Karen cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I made a mistake. I was trying to protect the integrity of our neighborhood." And Simmons held up a hand. "Stop. This wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to sign a form or misplacing a file. You orchestrated a calculated fraud. You forged the name of a sitting judge, used it to intimidate residents, and undermined the public's trust in the legal system." Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "I have considered your lack of prior criminal record," Simmons continued, "but the seriousness of your offense demands consequences." He leaned forward. "You are hereby sentenced to 90 days in county jail, 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a fine of $5,000 to be paid to the plaintiffs for damages." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the room. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was almost musical. I caught Evelyn's eye. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction there. Linda squeezed my hand under the table. Karen looked stunned, like she'd expected a slap on the wrist and maybe a fine. Jail time clearly hadn't been part of her mental script. As the bailiff approached, she glanced in our direction. Not a glare this time, more like a fleeting, defeated acknowledgement that she'd lost. On the way out, we passed a couple of neighbors who'd come to watch. One of them whispered, "Guess the HOA's going to need a new enforcer." I chuckled, maybe one that doesn't commit felonies. Back home, the neighborhood was buzzing. By lunchtime, half the street knew about the sentencing, and by dinner, the other half had heard the part about the jail time. I didn't even have to say anything. Word of mouth was doing all the work. The HOA president called an emergency meeting that evening to officially remove Karen from the board and bar her from holding any HOA position in the future. I didn't go, but Greg, the mothball-scented board member, stopped by afterward to fill me in. She tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, he said, shaking his head. But nobody bought it. We voted her out unanimously. Sandra even said she felt unsafe around her now. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen, who had spent years making everyone else uncomfortable, was now the one people didn't want to be near. Over the next week, the physical signs of her downfall started appearing. The HOA official vehicle sticker came off her car. The clipboard she used to carry around like a badge of honor was nowhere in sight. And most tellingly, the blinds in her front window stayed closed all day. Then came moving day. A plain white moving truck pulled up in front of her house early on a Saturday. A few men in work gloves started carrying boxes out while Karen hovered near the doorway, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I was outside trimming the hedges when she finally spotted me. For a moment, I thought she might say some half-hearted apology, maybe even an insult, but she just looked away, got into her car, and drove off without a word. As the truck pulled away a couple hours later, Linda came out onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "Well," she said, "I guess that's that." "Yep," I replied, watching the taillights disappear. End of an era. We stood there in the golden afternoon light, listening to the quiet. Without Karen's constant patrolling, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer. Even the air seemed easier to breathe. That night, we had a few friends over to celebrate. The grill was going, music playing, laughter drifting across the yard. One of the neighbors raised a glass and said, "To justice and to a neighborhood without Karen." Everyone cheered. As I looked around at the smiling faces, I realized something important. We hadn't just beaten Karen in court. We'd restored the balance in our little community. People weren't afraid to decorate their yards, park in the street, or have friends over without worrying about an HOA summons. Evelyn stayed for a while, sipping iced tea and chatting with Linda. Before she left, she pulled me aside. "You handled this with restraint," she said. "That's not easy when you're under attack. I'm proud of you." Coming from her, that meant more than I could say. Later, as the last of the guests left and the solar lights twinkled in the yard, I sat back in my chair, feeling the kind of peace you only get after a long fight is finally over. Karen might have thought she was untouchable, but in the end, she learned the hard way when you forge a judge's name, especially the judge who comes to your family's Thanksgiving dinner, you're writing the last chapter of your own story. And trust me, it's not a happy ending. In the weeks after Karen's grand exit, life in the neighborhood felt different, quieter, yes, but also warmer. People who used to keep to themselves were suddenly more social. You'd see neighbors chatting at the mailbox instead of hurrying back inside. Kids were playing street hockey in the cul-de-sac without anyone threatening to report them for unsafe activities. It's funny how one person's constant negativity can cast such a long shadow. And when that shadow disappears, you realize how much you'd been living under it. Linda and I took full advantage of the new atmosphere. We hosted a neighborhood cookout the first Saturday after Karen moved. The smell of burgers and hot dogs drifted through the air. Music played softly from a speaker, and laughter bubbled around the yard. Folks we'd barely spoken to before came over with dishes to share: potato salad, deviled eggs, fresh baked pies. More than once, someone leaned over and whispered, "It's so nice now," with a tone that made it clear exactly who they were talking about. Evelyn came too, though she made it clear she was there as family, not as a judge. Still, the way people approached her, shaking her hand and thanking her, you'd think she'd just saved the entire county from a disaster. About halfway through the cookout, Greg from the HOA walked over with a sheepish grin. "I'll admit," he said, "I should have spoken up sooner. Karen had the rest of us believing you were the problem. but watching how everything played out, I know better now. I clapped him on the shoulder. Better late than never. Greg, just promise me one thing: no more clipboards and tape measures in this neighborhood. He laughed, though I could tell he was only half joking when he said, I think we're all done with that kind of HOA enforcement. The following week, the HOA held elections to fill the empty board seat. For the first time in years, there were multiple candidates, and not one of them ran on a strict rules platform. The woman who won, a friendly retiree named June, promised her first act would be to review the bylaws and remove any unnecessary or outdated restrictions. It felt like a fresh start for all of us. One evening, Linda and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The roses we'd planted months earlier were in full bloom, the solar lights twinkling along the path. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, and thought about how close we'd come to losing this place, not because of any real legal issue, but because one person decided she could scare us into submission. You know, Linda said softly, if she had just come over and asked nicely about the lights or the garden, we probably would have compromised. I nodded. That's the thing about people like her. They don't want compromise. They want control. Evelyn had told me something similar after the trial. The law doesn't just punish wrongdoing, she said. It protects people from abuse of power, no matter how small or local that power might seem. It stuck with me, because it was true. Karen's HOA title wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but she wielded it like a weapon. And in the end, that weapon backfired. As for Karen, the last I heard, she'd moved to a condo in another county. Someone claimed they saw her at a grocery store, lecturing the cashier about the proper way to bag bread. So maybe she hadn't changed much. I didn't care. She wasn't my problem anymore. Instead, I focused on making our home exactly the way we wanted it. We added a porch swing, expanded the garden, and yes, installed even more solar lights. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at the thought of how much that would have driven Karen crazy. Life was good. A month after she moved out, a letter arrived from the court. Inside was the check for restitution, $5,000, just like the judge had ordered. Linda wanted to put it toward a vacation. I wanted to build an outdoor kitchen. We compromised and did both, booking a week at the beach and setting aside the rest for a grill upgrade. The first night we cooked outside on the new grill. A few neighbors wandered over, drawn by the smell. Before long, it turned into another impromptu gathering. Glasses clinked, the fire pit crackled, and someone joked that we should have a Karen-free anniversary every year. I raised my glass to that. Looking back, I realized the whole ordeal had taught me something I didn't expect. It wasn't just about standing up for yourself, it was about knowing how to stand up for yourself, going through the proper channels, keeping your cool, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting can be a lot more powerful than trying to fight fire with fire. And sometimes, the sweetest victory is simply living well in the place someone tried to take from you. That night, as Linda and I closed up the porch and headed inside, I glanced across the street at Karen's old house. The new owners had hung a big welcome sign on the door, and fairy lights sparkled in the windows. I smiled to myself. The neighborhood had moved on, and so had we. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that standing your ground doesn't always mean shouting the loudest or striking back in anger. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon you have is patience, evidence, and the truth. People who abuse their little slice of power eventually trap themselves. It's only a matter of time. And when that moment comes, justice doesn't just restore what you've lost, it gives you back your peace. So if you're ever backed into a corner, remember you don't have to fight dirty to win. Keep your head up, gather your facts, and let the truth speak for itself. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with someone who abused their authority? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of justice served, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories that hit home.